Hello and welcome to Africafé, the broadcast that talks about African organization and issues. Today we're going to talk about non-tariff barriers within the SADC community. But before that, let's look at this issue.
The Southern African Development Community, or SADC, is an intergovernmental organization headquartered in Gaborone, Botswana. The adoption by 9 majority-ruled Southern African countries of the Lusaka Declaration on April 1, 1980, paved the way for the formal establishment of the SADC in April 1980. The SADC has 27 legally binding protocols dealing with issues such as defense, development, illicit drug trade, free trade, and movement of people. Some of these protocols include Protocol on Energy, which is intended to promote harmonious development of national energy policies. Protocol on Gender and Development, aimed at accelerating the implementation efforts towards the achievements of concrete and transformative changes in the lives of women and girls in the region. Protocol on Politics, Defense and Security Cooperation, intended to foster regional security and defense cooperation, promote peace, political stability, and conflict management. The organization has 6 principal bodies: the Summit, comprising heads of state or heads of government, Organ on Politics, Defense and Security, Council of Ministers, the SADC Tribunal, the SADC National Committees, and the Secretariat.
So Denis, it's a pleasure to have you here with us today in Morocco. It's a pleasure to talk to you today. And today we're going to talk about something quite technical, non-tariff barriers in Africa. So just I'd love it if you could explain to us what are non-tariff barriers first, and also to tell us what is the impact of those non-tariff barriers on African economies.
Thank you for having me, Yusuf. It's a pleasure to be here in Rabat for the first time in Morocco. Non-tariff barriers, as you have rightly mentioned, are a bit technical, but I'll try to simplify it in as best way as I can. So non-tariff barriers are basically trade obstacles that have been imposed on the goods and services of another country by one country. These are separate from the regular tariffs that we know. So there are various reasons why we have non-tariff barriers. I think the first one is protectionist measures, whereby if one country is importing goods from another country, but those goods are already being made in the first country, it makes sense a bit for this country to impose non-tariff barriers. Now there are numerous types of non-tariff barriers, but not to be so technical about them, we basically have sanitary measures, phytosanitary measures, limitations on quantity of imports, things like that. Anything that is not essentially a tariff can be considered a non-tariff barrier.
And these things, they hinder the free trade and the potential of free-flowing goods within African economies, right?
Yes, you know, as it is, intra-Africa trade is only at about 16%. In contrast, in Asia we have about 60% of intra-Asia trade, and in the EU it's above 68%. So as you can see, Africa is lagging behind in intra-Africa trade. So non-tariff barriers don't help this issue. In fact, they make it more sophisticated. So if we can actually eliminate non-tariff barriers, what this means for the continent is immeasurable. First of all, we would be looking at an increase in about $450 billion by the time we get to 2030. And annually, we'd be looking at an increase in revenue of about $20 billion. So I think in the overall schemes of things, once we tackle non-tariff barriers, we would be able to lift a lot of people out of poverty and extreme poverty. At the moment, as it stands, if we were to implement the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, we would lift about 30 million people out of extreme poverty and about 60 million out of moderate poverty. So as you can see, if we can tackle non-tariff barriers, it would be for the greater benefit of the continent.
With these numbers that you're mentioning, Dennis, we would be talking about a miracle We'd be talking about an economical miracle at the same scale of what China has done with lifting like hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And obviously this is what we're looking for in the African continent. The ASFTA has been quite ambitious in terms of wanting to remove and alleviate all the barriers and obstacles to free trade and free-flowing trade between African countries. And what's interesting, even though it's technical, is that these non-tariff barriers, like they are quite subtle, but they can hinder quite enormously the commerce between two states.
Indeed.
And when we're talking about ASFTA and non-tariff barriers, you mentioned we talk about the African Union, we talk about regional institutions. I want to talk about the SADC, the South African Development Community. I know you're from Kenya. I know that Kenya is not part of the community per se, but I think that it has some kind of interactions with the countries that are part of it. So I want to ask you, what did this organization do to alleviate these non-tariff barriers and encourage free trade between member states?
Thank you. I think being a Kenyan, I'm not so far from the Southern Africa Development Community. In fact, the SADC has a partnership with EAC and COMESA, sort of a regional economic community merging whereby trade is facilitated. I think what is of note of how the SADC has tried to tackle non-tariff barriers, we've seen countries in the SADC progressively sign up to ratify the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. And this is particularly encouraging because as it stands, we are above 35 countries for the whole continent. If we can actually get at least most of the countries in Africa, if not all, to ratify this agreement, we will greatly ease intra-Africa trade. So I'm encouraged by the fact that numerous countries in the SADC have signed up, talking about South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Mauritius. So I think if we continue in this same trajectory, in no time we should have a vast majority of African countries signing up to ratify the Afcfta agreement.
Well, that's optimistic, and we're hopeful that we're going to move towards that. My last question to you, Dennis, is what are, as an expert, what are your recommendations to further alleviate non-tariff barriers and bolster free trade between African countries? Right.
I think from experience, the easiest recommendation I can give would be to eliminate bad governance. Bad governance in itself is a non-tariff barrier. If we eliminate non-tariff barriers through tackling bad governance, what happens, first of all, is that we have a reduction in a lot more non-tariff barriers such as corruption and things that hinder trade at the border. By eliminating bad governance, what we actually do is encourage the implementation of this agreement, because as far as these policies go, the policies already exist. It's actually the implementation that is the issue.
The implementation part, the leadership part.
Exactly. So if we can implement them better, at least, we can improve on tackling non-tariff barriers just across the whole continent. Another thing we can do is have some sort of more oversight over this. By oversight in this sense, I mean we should educate more people so that governments in Africa are answerable to their own citizens in how much they are doing in tackling non-tariff barriers. I don't necessarily mean the setup of an institution to oversee governments, because that's difficult to implement. Accountability and transparency, because governments are put in place by their citizens. So if you make them answerable to their citizens, in that the citizens can ask the governments, what are you doing to tackle non-tariff barriers in at least our regional economic community? We can, probably increase the kind of trade that we have in intra-Africa countries, at least from a meager 16%, so above 20 in the next 5 years or so.
Okay, so you did mention the numbers, and they are quite tremendous.
Indeed.
And free trade within the African continent could get millions of people out of poverty. So it is a necessity to get there.
Yes.
And basically what you're saying, Dennis, and it's quite interesting for me as a political scientist, is that it all goes back to good governance.
Yes.
So good governance, good leadership, good vision
Yes.
is necessary and urgent to implement this vision of a free-flowing economies in the within the African continent.
Indeed, you've put it perfectly.
Thank you so much, Dennis.
Thank you so much, Yusuf, for having me. Look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.
That's it.
To know more about this, you can consult our website, policycenter.ma, and see you soon for a next episode of Africafé.